Justice is balance. The world has a way of making this giant mess somehow work right down to your own home. Welcome to the Engel Angle. I am Fort Worth Star-Telegram columnist Mac Engel. Thank you very much for joining me. Trust me, you won't regret it. If you do, please complain to somebody else. It's not my problem. I hate stuff. I cannot stand crap. I'm talking about dustables that take up space in front of the thing that I need to access. Usually a plug outlet, sometimes a frying pan. I'm talking about the random pieces of junk that litter our homes. Stuff that we all bemoan that we have whenever we try to move. And we ask ourselves, why did I own this? Why did I buy this? Why didn't I just throw it away? George Carlin did a whole bit on stuff. Because when it belongs to you, it's stuff. When it's somebody else's stuff, it's shit. And he's actually right. Because what I have is stuff, not shit. However, I do realize I'm a bit of a raging hypocrite in this department because I have too much stuff. And I just can't quite seem to get rid of it either. In this case, this is stuff from my childhood that I am sure is worth millions of dollars on eBay. I'm talking about stickers, this XFL football. Let me see if I can show you. This XFL football. This was the XFL football from the first time the league started back in 2000. And I bought it for like, I don't know, $10. And I'm sure you can still see it has the price tag on it. And I'm so sure that eventually I'm going to blow it up and I'm going to display it because it's kind of one of those little cute sports mementos. No, I'm not. Because if you look at this football, the bladder inside of it is deflated and it's busted. So in order to fix this, I'm probably going to have to spend $50 to have a new bladder put inside of it, then to have it restitched and put air in it. Am I really going to do that? No, of course I'm not. So now I'm sitting with an object that for some reason I just can't get rid of. This is stuff. What else? Stickers. This is a Winston sticker, Winston cigarettes. This is a sticker from when it sponsored the American Motocross Association Pro Series. It's like back in the 80s. I've got like 7 or 8 of them. Get rid of them. I'm like, no. I won't do that. I'll put it on a magnet and my inner Pinterest dork will come out and I'll make a magnet out of this. No, I won't. Get rid of it. Football cards. Got a ton of them. And because I was a Cincinnati Bengals fan, I've got football cards of the crappiest franchise in the National Football League. This guy here was pretty good. Isaac Curtis. Yeah, no one wants this card ever at all. Get rid of it. I've got dozens of them. I've got some of the worst football cards ever, and they're still with me. I just need to get rid of them. Here's another one, a sticker from Hijackers. I don't know where I got this from, but I'm pretty sure it was cool back in the 80s when I followed auto racing. But this one, now these are different. This stuff is different. I'm not kidding. These are football cards from the 70s. You can tell there's a glare there. They're made out of plastic, and I have one from every franchise from like 1975, and I have multiple sets. I think I have 3 sets, Green Bay Packers, and I think it was from a popsicle set. So here's one from the Green Bay Packers, and it has a description of what what the franchise is known for on the back. So here's one from the Cincinnati Bengals when it had the really old logo from the 70s, and it just said Bengals across the helmet. Probably the biggest mail-in job ever in the history of logo designs in major sports. So on the back of the Bengals one, it says, making the tackle. From the football heritage that gave rise to the Massillon Tigers, that's a famous high school in Northeast Ohio near Cleveland, the Canton Bulldogs, and the Cleveland Browns, the new team in Ohio, the Cincinnati Bengals, is another hard-hitting bunch. Founded in 1968, the Bengals wasted no time in winning the AFC Central Divisions in 1970 and 1973. The well-coached team features a balanced attack and a sharp defense that makes it a perpetually strong contender. Not only is this thing really cool, but this piece of crap is full of crap because the Bengals always stunk. But I love these things, and I'm like, yeah, somebody's going to want to buy them. Nobody wants to buy them. Here's another one. A pristine, mint condition, Joe Morgan let me see if I can speak. Legends Collection commemorative coin. Mint condition. This is what the dork collectors say is so valuable. If it's in mint condition, you can sell it. No, I can't. It's on eBay right now. Nobody wants it. It's crap. Get it out. Now, here's one. This is cool. I followed racing back in the 70s. Well, really the 80s. I was too young for the 70s. So last year, I had an opportunity to interview legendary drag racer Don the Snake Perdome. We had lunch for about an hour. He's a great guy. And after it, he's in his 80s. He lives in California. He sends me a box of stuff and autographs one of these things. This is a matchbox of one of his cars, one of his first drag racing cars. And he signed it, Don the Snake Perdome. It's great. What am I going to do with it? Put it in my living room? So here's my challenge. I have all this stuff, and I put value on it because it's from my childhood, and I still like sports. But here's the reality. I'm 49, and I really just don't want it anymore. Here's the worst part. Neither does anybody else. I've asked friends who have kids, other kids, relatives, anybody, do you want it? The resounding answer is, meet my middle finger, no, I don't want your crap. So I have steadily put up this stuff, not crap, on eBay in hopes of making a few dollars to offset my losses. So far, I've sold a few things, nothing major. So what do? Do I keep this stuff in a box, in a closet, in hopes that maybe the eBay fairy flies down from the sky, kisses me on my ever-expanding forehead, and takes the stuff off my hands in exchange for a couple $100? Or do I just finally give up, put it in the box, drive down to Goodwill, and give away these earthly possessions that once meant so much to me, but now just take up space, both in my head and on the floor? I don't have the answer. What I do know is that if I'm going to complain about too much extra stuff in my house, I better get rid of mine first. My guest for this episode allows me to unleash my inner nerd. And at this point, I'm not really sure it's an inner nerd. I think it's an outer nerd. I am a bit of a World War II buff and American history geek. And today's guest hits both of these passions of mine. He's a total expert in both fields. He served in the Marines in the 1970s. He earned his PhD from Oxford, something that I was going to do, but I decided not to. I wanted something a little less lucrative. He later went on to serve and work for the Central Intelligence Agency, where he worked in many different roles, including for a long period of time as a historian and the curator for the CIA Museum. He's written several books, including Writer, Sailor, Soldier, Spy, Ernest Hemingway's Secret Adventures from 1935 to 1961. It's about the famed author's brief time working for the Soviet Union. It's a fascinating read. He also has a new book out titled Need to Know, World War II and the Rise of the American Intelligence. The book is about the origin of the CIA and how it came to be. It's a fascinating read. Please welcome Mr. Nicholas Reynolds. Be honest. How often do you wear a shirt with a collar?
Oh, a few times a week.
Is that like a quota?
That's right.
I really appreciate you doing this. And
my pleasure.
I was really excited when this book came down because this was a subject that fascinated me, and my knowledge of the CIA is really from about Harry Truman on. So I didn't really know its point of origin, which is obviously the purpose and the function of your book. So Nicholas, before I get to that, as a fellow writer, and I realize I'm not on your level, from beginning to end, how long did this book take you to complete?
Well, there's different ways of counting, but from the first word I wrote, which was at a spa in New Mexico, to submission, which wasn't the end, but to submission was a little over 2 years. And then it was another year of editing. And before that, there have been a couple of years of research.
Are you happy with it?
That's a great question that I don't get asked very much.
Yeah.
Of course, I know where the warts are. I know, oh my God, what if I needed to say a little more about this or a little less about that. I am happy with the big blue lines. I think I've taken it in the right direction. There are some details that I would do a little differently as people read the book. So a book like this, nobody's going to be, few readers are going to go, oh, he covered exactly what I wanted in the way I wanted him to. And so I get feedback like my grandfather was in World War II and he served in the 455th Radio Intelligence Battalion. I'd really like to know more about that and wish you had covered it. So I did my best to cover the big blue arrows that you could see if you were hovering at 30,000 feet so that we could see how we got from 1940 to 1945. That's really the purpose of the book, to show how American intelligence evolved from 1940 to 1945 and to look at how it left the country positioned for the Cold War. You don't know the Cold War is coming, of course, but World War II is over. And, a good bit of American intelligence sticks around after World War II. And that's what we see in the Cold War. So my argument is past this prologue. If you want to understand what happened during the Cold War, if you want to understand what the CIA did or NSA or some of the other organizations, it's very important to take a look at the origins.
Okay, so when you have conversations with whether it's professionals or even academics or casual citizens, and you start talking to them about your familiarity with the CIA, what do normally people get wrong when they first think of the CIA, what its function is?
Boy, another great question. A lot of people don't. The distinction between code breaking and espionage is not always clear in people's minds. And so it's as if they're all lumped together, mm-hmm. And that there's something called spying that covers the whole gamut of intelligence activities. And yes, you can use that word to cover a lot, but one thing that I try to bring out in the book is that the different kinds of intelligence call for different disciplines, and those disciplines create their own individual cultures. So you get a distinctive culture of code breaking. You get another one of law enforcement and the FBI. And then when you do espionage and special operations, you get yet another kind of culture. And so these cultures are almost as important as anything else in the mix, because that's one of the basic reasons why it takes so long for American intelligence to start to work together. It's still, the process isn't over yet, but the seeds are laid in World War II, and the plants that grow up are so different. And you really need you need a really good farmer who can understand the various crops that have sprung up. If I could use an extended metaphor for which my English teacher would punish me.
So before we dive into this a little bit, my familiarity with the CIA was based on mostly a book, at least its point of origin, that I read about Harry Truman. It was an extended interview with Harry Truman. You might be familiar with the book called Plain Speaking.
Sure, yeah.
Remember that one? It's really interesting.
Yeah.
Okay, so my understanding was that it was his office and his administration that created it. And its function, because Truman was a stickler for budget and for government spending, was that the CIA really functioned as an office for oversight and a consolidator of other government agencies. Am I right or way wrong?
You're right. I would take a couple of footnotes.
Okay.
So Truman's one of my heroes, and here's why. So Roosevelt had a completely different style of leadership. Roosevelt's a politician who he called himself the juggler. He says, I have one set of balls in one hand, another set of balls in the other hand, and they're completely different, and I don't let them see each other, and I just keep them moving. And that's how he ran the government, and somehow it worked, in part because he was such a good orator and he read people so well. But if you had a management consultant come and look at the Roosevelt administration, how it's doing Intel, the management consultant, after a while, would run out of the room screaming and refuse to ever come back. So Truman gets in. Roosevelt has told Truman almost nothing about major programs the government's running. So
he knew nothing about Oppenheimer's little project out in New Mexico. Correct?
Correct. He knew nothing about the atomic bomb. He knew nothing about code breaking. And they had left him at the Senate. The vice president had an office at the Senate. And, it's, a mile from the White House to the Senate? That can be a really long mile. And so he's got this tremendous learning curve from April 12th, when he becomes president, until the war ends, and then on for the rest of the Roosevelt term that he fills, and then his own. And I think he does a terrific job picking up from close to zero, and then getting to 50, and then pushing it towards 100. And so at the end of the war, he's got, and you're right. During the war, he is the guy who runs hearings on government waste and abuse, wartime waste and abuse. And I kind of like that about him. He's the orderly guy. He's like, okay, you didn't go to college, right? But he just has this common sense and sense of order. And he says, I don't know a whole lot about intelligence, but I know we need it, and I want to do it right. And so he inherits this cluster of activities from the Roosevelt administration, and he sets about, he orders studies, he checks in every so often. He doesn't just order the studies and walk away. He comes back, he says, how are we doing on this? What kind of progress are we making? Now, my book ends in 1946 when he creates something called the CIG, the Central Intelligence Group, which is basically a clearinghouse and not a very strong agency. But I mean, he acknowledges we're going to have to keep working at this until we get it right. And I think they do get pretty far down the road of getting things right. The act that creates the CIA is signed in 1947, and then amended a couple years later to give the CIA more authorities. And it also creates the Air Force and does other important things to the defense establishment. So I as I say, I'm a fan of him for trying to build a house that will stand. Does he get everything right? No, but he's making a darn good effort to do things in an orderly way and to create institutions that will stand the test of time. He's also really good at who he picks, I think, for these activities. If you look at the people around him, it's quite a solid crew.
Was the CIA formed on the basis of the OSS, which, from what I understand, from what I've read, was kind of a train wreck? A little bit, had a little bit of a clown show element to it. Those are my words, not anybody else's. But from what I've read, is that if you had 10 activities that the office of the OSS was doing during World War II, 9 of them or a couple of them might be pretty good, and 6 or 7 of them might be kind of a mess. Was it based on that? Was it based on the Brits and the success that they had with Bletchley Park and code breaking and Enigma? Or was it something maybe a little bit more devious the Soviets had in the NKVD. I'm not quite sure, or was it more an extension of the FBI?
Okay, the code breaking is an activity that hums along like by World War II standards, a well-oiled intelligence machine in the background. And it's pretty much separate from OSS. And the code breaking evolves between 1940 and 1945, and a lot of it is in collaboration with the Brits, and they kind of know what they want. And they have the equipment, they have the people, some of them get demobilized, but they keep enough to keep going. And they just quietly say, Mr. President, we got this good thing in the background. Is it okay with you if we just continue to do what we're doing? And oh, by the way, we're doing it with the British. And he basically says, yes, that's fine. So code breaking by itself is not the solution. The United States needs more than just code breaking, right? Because if the message that announces Pearl Harbor is not intercepted and decoded, you're lost. So you need other things as well, and that is in fact the case. I argue in the book there was no tactical warning for Pearl Harbor. So OSS was a lot of things, and it took the character in what you described was a function of the character of its boss, William J. Donovan, who was wonderful and terrible at the same time. He's the guy who was going in 10 different directions. There were people in OSS who said, General Donovan, no, we need to just pick one or two of these and run with them. So his fertile mind is spinning off all kinds of activities. Wouldn't be a bad thing in a think tank, but it's not that good a thing in the director of an organization. But OSS turns in a reasonably good performance in World War II when you consider there was nothing, zero, zip, absolutely nothing by way of an American espionage agency, that kind of intelligence agency in 1940. So, I mean, they get up to 13,000 people, and most of them are doing something worthwhile. But what OSS gives us is a cadre of officers who become interested in intelligence. That doesn't really exist in the United States before that. Yes, you have a few military intelligence officers and naval intelligence officers and FBI law enforcement types. You don't really have the guys who are thinking about how to spy on the Soviets, how to get the information on their mindset, how to collect strategic information about, let's say, their bomber force. And so that's you're building up the people who know how to do that, and enough of them stick around after the war, right? So that's one big thing is OSS creates a cadre of American intelligence officers who will stay around after the war. The other thing OSS gives us is the idea that you have one agency that does a number of things. So it does research and analysis. It does secret intelligence, which means recruiting spies and stealing secrets. And it does special operations, which in World War II is people parachuting behind the German lines. So all three of those principal activities, and it's independent, right? So it doesn't work. It's not part of the State Department. It's not part of the Department of Defense. It's part of the executive, and ideally works directly for the president. So that's what OSS gives us, and that's what you see in CIA. You see that basic organization, give or take, and you see a lot of the same people who worked in OSS working in CIA.
What did Herbert Hoover think of the creation of the CIA?
Herbert or J. Edgar?
J. Edgar. Did I say Herbert? Sorry.
You said Herbert.
Oh, sorry. No, J. Edgar.
Herbert
Of
was
course,
Herbert.
Thank you.
Herbert was still around, actually. That's an interesting.
Yeah, I doubt he would have cared at that age, but
Well,
I'm thinking of J. Edgar. Sorry.
he stayed engaged. I mean, he's an interesting guy in his own right. J. Edgar. So J. Edgar's idea was, folks, you can just leave everything to me. You know,
I've got this.
I got this. What is it? The officer on the scene says, "Nothing to see here, folks. Please move along."
Keep moving.
That would be his mantra. If he, I don't know if he ever actually said that, but his thought was he could do it all. He could do law. So he starts out doing law enforcement. He professionalizes federal law enforcement. Then he adds a little bit of, so in the 30s, he adds counter-espionage to that, starts catching a few German spies. And then around 1940, he says, we can do this foreign intelligence thing too. This is pre-Donovan. He says, we can just run spies and collect information, and everything will just be fine. You don't need to ask all these questions. Just leave it to me. And it turns out that the FBI is well suited to law enforcement and counter-espionage, but espionage is a completely different activity. In the one activity, you're trying to catch people who are spying, and so it's law enforcement. In the other activity, you're trying to break the law. Ideally, you're breaking foreign laws, right? You're stealing the enemy's secrets, and it's a different mentality. And it turns out that Hoover and the FBI, they have an intelligence service that is active in South America during the war, and it just doesn't produce because they're set to enforce the law, not break the law. And so the reports that they send to Washington and during the war are like, we caught 50 German spies. And the question that's not being answered is, well, what's the government of Argentina's policy towards the Third Reich? So that's a long answer to your question, what J. Edgar thought. But so Harry Truman there's two people Harry Truman particularly doesn't like: William J. Donovan and J. Edgar Hoover. And he thinks Donovan's too big for his britches, besides being a Republican. And J. Edgar, who Truman says, I don't want an American Gestapo. And he's thinking of J. Edgar when he says that. So he wants him to stay in a particular, here are the rules, here's the constraints under which you will operate. And he does a terrible, terrible thing. He cuts off Hoover's direct access to the Oval Office. In the old days, Hoover and Roosevelt weren't close, but Hoover got a reasonable amount of private time with President Roosevelt, and like the politician and juggler that he was, they used it to say, well, what do you know about this, Edgar? Can you find out a little more about that? And this kind of informal spying and the it's not quite the trading of favors, because the President Roosevelt is so much more powerful than the director of the FBI. But there's something of that there. There's like, I do a little for you, you do a little for me, and Hoover is like he's like somebody at the court of Louis, who's the one who lost his head, 14 or 16, 16, right? Louis 16. He can be just shameless in buttering up people in the Roosevelt administration that he had absolutely nothing in common with and probably didn't even like. I mean, I found some letters that are just so florid. This sitting next to you at dinner the other night was the social event of the year for me. Just
blatant ass kissing,
just over the top. So anyway, that I think that answers. That's what.
But because the United States was so far behind in 1939, 1941.
Right.
They were so far behind in military and intelligence, what you're talking about. What I'm trying to figure out is, what was the CIA modeled after specifically? Was there another office where somebody else, or Donovan, somebody, one of the generals, let's say Nimitz, any of these guys, or even Roosevelt or Truman said, we need that?
I think it's, there's a lot of churn when the war ends and
Right.
Truman sends the OSS home. But I think the model they come up with, they explicitly say this is the OSS model. I don't think so, but they do. They have the basic elements of OSS there, so to the extent that there is one model, that's it.
So,
and you add independence in there, because OSS was an agency of the Joint Chiefs. We tend to forget that. So they were down a couple layers in the hierarchy, and Donovan hated that. Donovan wanted to have unfettered access to the president, and here he is. He's got to work through the staff system at the Joint Chiefs, and his boss is actually General Marshall.
So I want to fast forward a little bit, 10, 15 years after where your book ends. So they create the CIA, and then as time progresses, this office gets a little bit more involved in the to-dos of other governments in other countries. When this office opened and became an official government entity, would anybody have involved then said, yes, do the Bay of Pigs? That's a great idea. Or was that something that came way later in its evolution?
So that's a good question. So if you look at OSS, you see people who would say, the wilder the operation, the better it is. Take the long shot, take the big risk, take the flyer. If you don't take a big risk, you're not going to get a big gain. And you have those people in OSS, and in fact, you see some of the same guys who are in OSS involved in Bay of Pigs, and you also see the other kind of guys who say, okay, let's take it one step at a time. Let's not overreach. You see some people who in OSS who are uncomfortable with the idea of ambitious special operations and argue that this is not something that they should be doing. So this is a tension that starts in World War II between the guys who think that a secret intelligence agency is a magic bullet. So that's the guys who would give you something like the Bay of Pigs. And then you see the other guys who say, no, an intelligence agency is part of the greater machine of the U.S. government, and it needs to support broader initiatives. It's not a substitute. It's not a replacement. It's a complement. So those are two different approaches to intelligence. And as I say, you see that developing in World War II, and then you see it continue. And actually, I'm not a Bay of Pigs guy, but scholar, but you see within CIA, you see people who said, what were they thinking? Right. And you see other ones going like, well, no, this is what we're here for. And some of these people, as I say, on both sides are OSSers who started to form their mindsets during World War II.
So you have this organization that was formed by a guy who was a stickler for budget constraints and for spending and for fiscal responsibility. I'm talking about Truman.
Yeah.
Now we're here in 2022 in this office. At least my perception of it is a gigantic arm of the Department of Defense, however you want to define it. You used an expression. I actually wrote it here. I've got a list of questions on my screen, Nicholas, and it's so funny you use the expression from from its point of origin to today in 2022. Has the CIA gotten a little too big for its britches?
Well, I like to say that we ought to call Director Burns or Director Haynes and ask them that question. I would say the issue in American intelligence is right sizing, and that starts in the war. How much of this do we need, and what kind of authorities are we going to let it have? We now have 18 intelligence agencies. How many do we need?
Did you say 18?
18, correct. So
I mean, that's tripping over themselves.
That's the issue, right? So each service has its own. There's DIA. The individual government agencies have their own intelligence offices. So, how much do you need? That's question one. I don't. Each, and that's a question that's so hard to answer, because let's say you're the Manhattan Project, right? And like DOE, so you're an early DOE. Well, does DOE need intelligence? Does a Manhattan Project need its own intelligence officer? You bet. They'd be crazy not to have it. But the question is, do they need 5, 50, 100? And then the other question is, what authorities do you give them? What restrictions do you place on them? And that's where I'm a little. So I don't have a good answer for what the right size of American intelligence is, and I'm not sure anybody does. But I do think that we're better off today than we were 20, 30, 40 years ago, because the authorities, the regulations get more sophisticated. What you see in World War II, when the reason Donovan can go off in 10 directions at once, is nobody's saying, hey, Bill, this is exactly what I need you to do. I don't need you to do these other things. And oh, by the way, some of them are illegal. And so as time goes on and the agencies mature, not just the CIA, but American intelligence in general, you see people defining their lanes. You see regulations. You see legislation. So which I think is a good thing. So I'm somebody who's been a bureaucrat, right? And I don't think bureaucrat's a dirty word. You can be a good bureaucrat or you can be a bad bureaucrat. So I am encouraged that we're in a better place today. The third thing I'd say is professionalism. So in World War II, you don't have any intelligence professionals. You can't. It's only with the exception of some of the code breakers, because they start out in a profession which is basically math, statistics, and then they do their magic. And so there is a profession that's growing between the world wars. But for the rest of the intelligence lay down in the United States, there are no real intelligence officers. So, it takes a while for a profession to build up. It's like in World War II, we're like the medical profession before it figured out that you ought to wash your hands between patients. They just don't, and that's not to reflect negatively on them. They don't know what they don't know. And just as the doctors didn't know they should wash their hands when they went from one patient to the other.
You mentioned oversight. My perception sometimes of the CIA is that they're independent, but they're not. Sometimes they're an arm of the White House. Sometimes they're not. Nicholas, who's the oversight on the CIA?
Well, I think so. I think basically these days, I think oversight works. That's my.
But who's doing it?
Well, I mean, you have committees. You have committees. You have now. If you have a president who's not interested, so the ultimate oversight, whether it's Roosevelt, Truman, or any of their successors, the ultimate oversight's the president, right? So if you have a president who's not really interested in intelligence, who just says, "Oh, you boys go and do whatever it is you do, don't tell me."
I just don't want to know about it.
I just don't tell me. I don't want to know. So that's giving up a good bit of oversight. But then you also have the legislation, and then you have you have congressional committees that I think assert themselves, and I think you have a pretty robust. You have some of this in World War II, but the sense that you don't break American law. I mean, that's kind of the for me personally, that's kind of the basic ground rule here is that what is it we used to say? You don't case officer the case officer, and in this case, the American people, you work for the American. I know I sound like Mary Poppins here, but you work for the American people, and you better remember who you work for.
So we have, you said 18.
Depends how you count, but that's a common number.
Okay, so 18. We've spent God knows how much money on intelligence, spy everybody. We have these things now, which knows everything that we're doing, even though it says, "Hey, we're not tracking you." Okay, that's cute. But there is, I think, this idea that all of these intelligence communities should work in harmony with one goal, which is to protect America in our interest. Do they?
Again, you're asking me a question way beyond what I set out to answer.
What's your gut take? No, what's your gut take?
I think the answer is yes. I mean, yeah. So here's one way that I like to answer the question. So when we first, it's like going halfway to the wall. So you start out 20 feet from the wall and you go halfway, 10 feet. So you're half. And you keep going halfway. Are you ever going to get to the wall? No. It's human beings involved here. It's government. It's going to be messy. There is no perfection, but you keep getting closer and closer to the wall. So I like to think we're making progress, and we started the journey in World War II.
You did another book that was quite successful, Writer, Sailor, Soldier, Spy. How on earth did you come up with that? Did you unearth that one?
So that's kind of a shaggy dog story in itself, but this in a way is a more conventional book for a guy like me who's trained to go to the archives and come out after a couple of years and try and sum it up. So I found a reference to Hemingway having been recruited by Soviet intelligence in 1940. And I thought, this is huge. It was fairly well sourced. And, it wasn't like a JFK assassination conspiracy theory. Some of them are like, wow. And others are like, just barely possible. But they all lack, there's a missing link in all of them, and this didn't have the missing link. This was really good evidence that he had signed up with the Soviets, and I thought, this is huge. Here's this. Hemingway is like this model of Americanism of truth, justice, the American way, how we speak, how we write. And he works for the Soviets, please. So I looked around, and I expected that there would be an article somewhere, or somebody had written a book to explain, this is how it happened, and wrapped it up in a neat little package for us, and gave us so we didn't have to lie awake at night wondering why Hemingway was a Soviet spy. So nobody did that. I mean, there is one good book that includes a chapter on this, but basically nobody explained what this meant to for Hemingway's work, in how it fit into the context of his life, and how it affected his life. And so in the end, Hemingway was not a great Soviet spy.
Good. That led to my last question. You've written several books. I know those are a labor of love, but sometimes it's a labor. Can you tell me, are you working on another
sometimes
book?
Yeah, sometimes it's labor and sometimes it's love. Sometimes it's more labor, sometimes it's more love. So these are OSS guys who
This is your next book.
Which I'm working with a very skilled historian and journalist, and so it's the story of a man named Pete Ortiz, and Pete is he's legally American and culturally French, and he goes from his parents divorced, and he goes back and forth between Paris and Los Angeles, and he joins the French Foreign Legion because he doesn't want to go to college. And then when World War II breaks out, so he's born, let's see, he would have been born 1910 or so. And then World War II breaks out, and he goes back into French uniform. The Germans capture him, and they go, "What are you? Who are you? What are you doing here?" And he escapes, and he comes to the United States, and he tries to become an officer in the U.S. military, and there's no category for a guy like this. He's a high school graduate, but he has no college. He speaks perfect French. He's been an acting officer in the Foreign Legion. He can do all these things. There's no category. So he enlists in the Marine Corps. He's at like 30 at this point. And everyone else going to Paris Island is like 17, right? 17, 18. And there's granddad here. And finally an officer realizes this guy is really different. And so they send him to OSS. Then he parachutes behind German lines. And it's just it's an amazing story. So, basically what I'm thinking of doing as follow-on project is picking out kind of individuals or individual activities from this book and then elaborating on them. And the code breakers are that's another category of person that I want to look at. And again, what I'm interested in is, what did it feel like to do this? Not okay, he invented this code breaker invented this machine and it worked like this, and its significance in the development of code breaking is X or Y. There are a lot of experts who are better qualified than me to do that. But what was it like to be an early code breaker? It may be too much of a challenge to figure out how. These guys most of them didn't keep diaries, right? They didn't come home. They're actively discouraged from keeping diaries. So it may be a real trick to try and figure out, well, what did it feel like to come home and say nothing about what you did at work, right? You're trying to break the Japanese code, and that's what you do all day. And then you come home and you sit at dinner with your wife, and you can't say one word about it, but it has occupied your whole being. So what happens? So that's the kind of thing I'm playing with, and what stress for these guys. Some of these guys, not just code breakers, but working in Intel can be very, very stressful. So some people master that stress, and it's not a big deal. Other people who serve and do their job and more, the burdens drive them crazy. So that's the kind of thing I like to play with. Is what's left at the end of the day? What's the greatest generation suffered the same things that subsequent generations suffer. So in terms of PTSD, post-combat stress, wounds, we see this coming to the fore after the Civil War, but we seem to kind of trick ourselves that once the war's over, the problems go away, right? It's done. We're finished. Yeah. The Nazis are gone. The soldiers went home. American soldiers, they lived happily ever after. Well, my argument is, no, it's not over. It's never over. and especially World War II. World War II just keeps what is going on in the Ukraine right now, or Ukraine, and that's like straight out of World War II.
It is.
Excuse me, Mr. Putin, but that's so last century, and that there should be that there's a conventional war in Europe and people are suffering in the same way they suffered in 44 and 45 on the same turf. I'll bet some of the people who are in cellars in Ukraine now were in the same cellars when the Germans and the Soviets were fighting. There are not going to be too many of them, but I'll bet there's a handful who goes, oh no, not this again. We already did this once.
Yeah.
Anyway,
Nicholas,
sorry to get carried away here.
No, not at all. I really appreciate your time. The book is terrific. I look forward to your next work, and I very much thank you for your time. This was fascinating. Thank you.
Oh, well, it's my pleasure. I'm going to call and interview you. You've got a great job.
Thank you very much. Anytime. Thank you very much.
You bet. Take care.